Many of us are familiar with the story that unfolded in Montgomery, Alabama on Thursday, December 1st, 1955, when a 42-year-old Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat on her bus ride home. You know this story, right? We know this story. Rosa was the last person to make an enemy. She was a sweet soul, but she found herself making many enemies that day on her ride home. The law required black riders to sit in the back of the bus. And I just learned this because we celebrated her feast day this month. But she was sitting in the back of the bus. She was sitting in the first row in the back of the bus in which black folks could sit, where the white section ended and the black section began. But when the white section was full and a white man entered the bus driver asked the first row of black riders to stand and give their seats to make another white row. Did you know that? Everybody stood in that front row except for Rosa. She said in her autobiography, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically, no. The only tired I was tired of giving in." Many people perceive Jesus' calling to his disciples this morning in that reading to love your enemies as passive, conflict avoiding, agreeable, peaceable in some way. And this is not what Rosa did. But what we know about what Rosa did was it was right. It was good. It was godly. Jesus taught us, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who abuse you. Is this what Rosa did? When segregation policies and her racist neighbors dehumanized her and those who looked like her, she was given an enemy. And I believe her resistance was a really good example of the kind of enemy love that Christ is teaching us. And it may not be apparent to us by face value, but this morning I want to spend some time and look at this teaching and say, what does Jesus really mean by loving our enemies in this way? When I say the word enemy this morning, you may pull up some people. In fact, I want you to. It's sort of helpful so that you're not just thinking about this in theory, but that you can begin to work this out in your real life. So when I say enemy, you may pull up some people in your mind, maybe a category of people, maybe some person, maybe some family member, or friend, or colleague, maybe someone you don't know who's across the world. Pull that up. I wonder, with those enemies in mind and in view, here's what I wonder. I wonder if too often our enemies aren't the right ones. Or honestly, they're just not that interesting or that great of enemies. And here's why it matters. Without a really worthy enemy, I don't think Jesus' teaching makes much sense for us. And I think as Christians, we'll be bored to death. We can afford to practice the love of enemies in cheap ways when we have unworthy enemies, like not very interesting enemies. If your enemies are those that disagree with you on Facebook, maybe that's just a disagreement. If your enemy is someone you just don't like, or maybe someone who doesn't like you, maybe you just don't like each other. I'm not sure that's an enemy. I'm not saying that any of these situations can't produce or provide for us enemies in our lives, but that maybe the problem is that we just need better enemies in our lives. You laugh, but I'm dead serious. I believe, maybe I'm wrong, that when we do this, as the psalmist says, when we commit our ways to the Lord, when we put our trust in the Lord and do good, we will encounter enemies worth having. We suddenly find, when we do this, the richness of Jesus' teaching, the depth of what he's trying to convey to us. And we will experience God's promise, as the psalmist says in verse 42, the Lord will help them and rescue them. He will rescue them from the wicked and deliver them because they seek refuge in God. This promise that we prayed together in the Psalms this morning, in Psalm 37, this promise anchors us in the goodness of God. The assurances of what surely God will do for those who fight for righteousness, who obey God, who do what is right and good in the eyes of God. And when we are anchored in such immovable ways, when we're committed to the ways of the Lord, we will encounter the enemies of God. We shouldn't be naive about this. So much so that we can actually express the costly love that Jesus is outlining here in his teaching. We actually have a real opportunity to express this kind of love of enemies in meaningful and costly ways. Verse 29 in Luke 6 says, if anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you. When we read this elaboration on what Jesus means by love your enemies, we find that Jesus' love that he's expressing here to us is not a feeling. It's not being nice. It's the power of God demonstrating a new order of love in the world. This is a new way of being a human being in society. And I know this sort of goes against the grain of everything maybe we've been taught about what to do. We've been taught to pay it back, right? Retribution, vengeance. But this kind of love accomplishes infinitely more than violence ever could. This kind of love leads us to resist evil and take concrete and costly actions on behalf of our neighbors in love. And not just actions that we think we should take, but the actions that we have already seen God take toward us when we, in our decisions, in our sin, positioned ourselves as enemies of God. We can simply observe God's love toward us and get an idea of what it looks like to then love our enemies. Because without love, whatever that we do is worth nothing, as we prayed this morning. The other genius of Jesus' teaching, and by the way, my assumption here is that Jesus isn't just giving us spiritual platitudes and oh, that's sweet, that's not going to work, that's unrealistic. I actually think Jesus is brilliant. I think Jesus knows exactly what he's talking about better than we know what we're talking about. That's my assumption. So I think fundamentally this teaching is genius. Another genius part about it is I think that this teaching exposes the wrongdoer. It exposes the oppressor. The wrongdoer, the oppressor, those who deal in evil would never use these tactics. Not with their enemies. The real enemies of God operate with domination, with coercion, with violence. This enemy does whatever it takes to win. The means justifies the end, sort of thinking. But the power of God, on the other hand, raises the dead. It overcomes death with life. It disarms violence with the force of love. So let's test drive this theology, right? Let's take it for a spin, okay? Are poor, undocumented immigrants really our enemy? Or is it a chaotic, under-resourced border and the inhumane treatment of the most vulnerable of our neighbors? Yeah, that seems like a much more worthy enemy, right? Is our enemy our gun-owning neighbors? Or is it the NRA lobby and those organizations that care way more about the availability of semi-automatic weapons than they do about the lives of children in schools? You see the difference of the enemy? Are those who are unable to afford healthcare, basic needs, education, housing, are they really the enemy of our society? Or is it record corporate greed and inflation and record numbers of billionaires? You see what I'm saying? And bought politicians who have lost their integrity. Who's the enemy here? I think maybe one way of saying this is, let me make sure I don't say this in a way that Alex makes a short out of this, but when we have chosen to make the enemies out of the most vulnerable in our society, I feel like we should get a life. Maybe get a worthy enemy. I don't think they're the enemy. And our society, y'all, keeps coming at us. Our society determines, it pre-chooses our enemies for us. Let me tell you who your enemy is. And many times we just take that and without inspecting it, we just sort of receive it and adopt it and work on it. Drag queens, trans people, gay folks, the woke mob, conservatives, diversity, equity, and inclusion, liberals, welfare recipients, those who need health care, white people, black people, brown people, old folks, millennials. Millennials, man, they got the worst of it, some of that. But are these our enemies? Really? The table we come to this morning, friends, gives us a real enemy. And none of these sort of cheap, not very interesting, and frankly untrue enemies. The table we come to gives us actual enemies, indeed much greater enemies. When the world's sin and violence meant to destroy and bury God, the power of God raised Christ to new life. And because Christ is truly raised, this is the argument Paul has been making in 1 Corinthians 15 that we've read over the last few weeks. When Christ is truly raised, we are now offered the power of that sacrificial love that raised him from the dead. That is now the power that exists within us, beloved. That is the power available to us. Why would we opt for any other power, any less powerful thing like violence or coercion or domination when we have the power of love that raised Christ from the dead? Why? That's what's on offer to us this morning at this table. But be careful, because Christ's love makes us real enemies of the same darkness that Christ has already overcome. This is not a safe table to gather around. You become enlisted in the cause of God and of his love in the world. The table empowers us to be like Rosa, by the grace of God, refusing to give in to any unjust law, any dehumanizing policy or practice, any compromise with evil, and any trampling of the vulnerable. So be careful. You might be like Rosa. Resurrection, I know that this isn't your first rodeo, especially with taking up the cause of the vulnerable. I'm so proud that that's a part of our story. You and I have seen the joy of God's mission overcoming worthy enemies of exclusion and of harm. And that doesn't mean we all agree about everything. No, but what we do agree on is the practice of love. The practice of love. Again and again. We have good reason to obey Jesus and to believe this teaching, who leads us into conflict again and again. If you've been a part of this church long enough, or really any church, you've seen plenty of conflict. Seems like we keep bumping into it. But that conflict tempts us to take up each other as enemies when we are not each other's enemies. The conflict is an invitation for us to perceive something deeper, to discern a true enemy, a deeper enemy. And as we do, the good news is that we will participate in a different kind of power than the world tempts us to take up. One that subverts the logic of domination or manipulation and is willing to work liberation through long suffering with one another in love. This is the power of love that we have available to us. So by the grace of God, may we find that courage to open up our hearts and hands to face those enemies with the power of God's love and with nothing else. Amen.